Thanks everyone who's joined us today for this symposium presentation. My name is Katie Lass and I'm a Senior Research Analyst at the Policy and Research Group. I'm joined by Hannah Diapice, Audra Wingard, and Tan Nguyen from Empirical Education, and also Ann Wolf from Apt Associates. And we'd like to thank SREE for providing us with this opportunity to share our research with you guys today virtually. And we also recognize that there are a lot of competing priorities right now. The school year just started, lots going on, so we appreciate everyone who took time today to join us. So the theme of the 2023 conference was Practical Significance and Meaningful Effects, Learning from and Communicating What Matters. And the members of this symposium connected with this theme because we had either just finished or were in the process of sharing findings from our I3 evaluations. And so we were having those very conversations about what does it all mean for the interventions we were studying. As many of you guys know, we as researchers aim to answer the question of what works in education settings, and we aim to do it in a clear and rigorous fashion. But we also know that what works for some might not necessarily work for others, or it may work differently. So an intervention in one setting may not work the same way in another setting. And as evaluators, our task is not just to answer the question of what works on average, but to help programmers and consumers of research develop a deep understanding of how, when, and why a program works. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So our symposium is Unpacking the Logic Model, a discussion of mediators and antecedents of educational outcomes from the I3 program. So the presenters on this symposium are going to share methods and findings from 4 different evaluations that were conducted under the Department of Education's Investing in Innovation program, which has since been rebranded as Education, Innovation, and Research, or the EIR program. And the I3 program was a 3-tiered research initiative that awarded funding based on the level of existing evidence of effectiveness. 3 of our presentations today represent development tier grants that offered the opportunity to develop and test the efficacy of innovative practices. And then the remaining presentation will present findings from a validation grant, which aim to further develop and scale up an intervention. The underlying goal of our symposium today is to highlight the different ways in which exploratory research on inner mechanisms driving program effectiveness can provide useful information to practitioners and educators alike. And then after our 4 presentations, we'll hear from Ann Wolf at Apt, who will offer some reflections on the symposium presentations. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A, hopefully. If at any point during any of the presentations you'd like to pose a question to a presenter, please submit them through the chat function and identify which presenter it's aimed at if possible. And then of course, if you haven't already, please mute your phones to avoid any feedback. All right. So for the first presentation, I'll talk about PRG's evaluation of peer group connection, which is a cross-age peer mentoring program that aims to make the transition from middle to high school a positive experience for students. Specifically, I'm going to give a high-level, non-technical overview of how PRG and CSS collaborated to build a comprehensive exploratory study to unpack the different dimensions of PGC and the kinds of research questions we aim to answer. My hope is that some evaluators in the audience may get some ideas for how they can help their programmers better understand their programs, and that programmers may get ideas for the types of questions that they can bring to their evaluators to gain that meaningful and practical information about their program's impact. So disclaimer slide, it was funded by I3. So the peer connection study was an individual level RCT that took place in high schools in rural North Carolina from fall 2016 to spring 2019. At each participating school, 9th grade students were randomly assigned to participate in PGC or to be in a class as usual control group. The confirmatory outcomes of this evaluation were daily attendance at school and the number of credits earned toward graduation at the end of 9th grade. And then we had a number of additional exploratory outcomes that included mediating attitudes and behaviors that are associated with dropout prevention, such as disciplinary events, engagement with school, educational outlook, and social and emotional skills. Our data sources included administrative records and self-report questionnaires, and our outcomes were assessed at the end of 9th grade. So a little bit about PDC itself. PDC is a peer-to-peer group mentoring model that trains 11th and 12th grade students, who are called peer leaders, to meet with small groups of 9th graders called peer groups, to work through a curriculum of activities designed to help ease the transition into high school. 9th graders get to interact with these older students who act as mentors, and also with other 9th graders that they might not otherwise have the opportunity to socialize with. The 11th and 12th grade peer leaders attend a daily leadership course and earn high school credit, while the 9th grade participants attend weekly peer group meetings called outreaches led by those peer leaders. And the goal of the PDC program, or the goals, are to enhance student engagement in school, build leadership, academic, social, and emotional skills, and support academic outcomes. This is just a visual representation of the structure of the program. So as I mentioned, we aim to answer a number of exploratory research questions to better understand the how, when, and why of PDC's effect on outcomes related to dropout prevention. To this end, we utilize the extensive baseline and implementation data collected throughout the 3-year implementation period to see if there were any identifiable trends that might inform CSS's continued development of the PDC program beyond what the confirmatory study offered. Our 3 main exploratory questions were there any variations in the program's impact for different subgroups of students? Were there any variations in impact under different school level implementation conditions and decisions? And how much of the program does a student need for it to have an effect? So PDC by design is a flexible program that can be implemented in a number of different ways at a school, depending on their priorities and capacity. The program is also meant not only to reach a diverse student population, but also connect students with diverse backgrounds. So by looking at impacts for different groups and under different implementation conditions and dosage levels, we aim to better understand some of the mechanics behind how the program works, and also inform future research on the intervention. So for our subgroup analyses, like I said, we had a rich set of baseline and covariate data, both from our administrative records and from our baseline self-report questionnaires. And we use these data to construct a wide range of subgroup definitions to look at variations in program impact for different students. Subgroups were defined based on demographic characteristics and also baseline attitudes towards school and education. So in short, we ran a bunch of models with different subgroup interaction terms and then summarized findings visually to identify patterns in the data. The point of this exercise was not necessarily to determine program impact on specific subgroups for the sake of promoting instances of significant findings, but rather to identify those patterns across subgroups that might deserve further attention that may have been hidden by the overall treatment effect estimate. So for example, we looked for trends to see if any particular subgroups fared better on multiple outcomes and or which outcomes had more widespread impact across different subgroups. Since some results would be significant just by chance, we did not really focus on significant findings that were standalone cases or were not corroborated by a pattern. So for our implementation study, so because PDC is a flexible program that can be implemented in a number of different ways, our second question aimed to understand what the core components of the program were that were associated with improved outcomes, compared with others that may have been less impactful. Our schools all chose to implement the program slightly differently. Some chose to implement for just the fall semester instead of the full year, They each chose different sessions from the full curriculum to present, and then different schools offered varying numbers of sessions throughout their implementation period. So using the data collected from that implementation evaluation, we defined several school contrasts that could inform how CSS might work with schools as they prepare for future implementation of PGC. Some of these measured school level fidelity thresholds related to the number and type of sessions that were offered, whereas others measured different ways that the program could be implemented. And then lastly, our third exploratory study focused on a case analysis. So as I said, PGC is a complex multi-session intervention. We conducted a case analysis that aimed to determine how much of the program students needed for it to have a positive effect on outcomes. So for anyone unfamiliar with this type of analysis, there's a lot of information, a growing body of literature, particularly in social and educational research, that discusses when and how researchers can apply different case analyses to supplement their ITT findings. And I have just one citation that was helpful for ours at the bottom of this slide. So our implementation evaluation showed us that dosage levels varied widely across and within schools. The number of sessions that treatment students attended ranged from 0 to 30. We defined full participation in the PGC program as having gone to 16 or more outreach sessions, since the core structure of the program involves regular and consistent meetings with your peer groups to work through the extensive curriculum. So only about 40% of treatment students met this threshold of participation. Some of this was due to school level implementation challenges where schools weren't able to offer the minimum number of sessions. And then some of that was a result of individual level uptake and attendance at the offered sessions. So we compared two different approaches. Both are derived from principal stratification framework, but which have different assumptions. And both aim to estimate the effect of participating in PGC, not just being offered the opportunity to participate. And again, both utilize the baseline data to try to predict whether or not a student in the control group would have participated if offered the program. So in short, we identified several promising findings from this process. Among the different subgroups of students, we saw that PGC appeared to have a stronger, more positive effect on reducing disciplinary events with male students, with students who had negative attitudes towards growth mindset at baseline, and for students who didn't expect to have a college degree or achieve a college degree at baseline. With regard to the implementation features, we found that when schools offered at least 18 sessions, which is the minimum recommended threshold, when they offered the core type of sessions in the curriculum and or when they were implementing the program for the first time, students in the PGC group at these schools were less likely to receive disciplinary infractions and scored higher on several measures of SEL skills and engagement. And then lastly, for our case analyses, those indicated that when students participate fully in the program, they're less likely to get suspended, earned higher GPAs, and had higher scores on several non-cognitive scales compared to the would-be compliers identified in the control group. So our next steps are going to be to examine PGC's impact on longer-term outcomes at 10th grade and beyond, and do a number of similar exploratory analyses on those outcomes. So that's a quick summary of this work, which will hopefully be presented in more detail in our final evaluation report and in a manuscript on the case analyses made public, hopefully by the end of this year. All right, so our next presentation is going to be from Hannah Diapice at Empirical Education, who will be presenting on Empirical's RCT evaluation of enhanced units, which is a science and social studies project developed by SRI and CAS and funded by an I3 development grant.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. My name's Hannah Diapice, and I'm excited to present on Empirical's RCT evaluation of the Enhanced Units project, which supports content area learning in biology and US history. I was the research manager on the project during the 2017-2018 school year, and am currently a rising third-year doctoral student at Stanford University. Additional members of the Enhanced Units team that are in attendance today include Andrew and Jenna, Empirical's Chief Scientist and VP of Research Ops. I'll start with a brief overview of the Enhanced Units project, followed by the study design. After describing the results of the evaluation, I'll review conditions to support impact, as well as areas for improvement and follow-on research. So about the project, Enhanced Units was developed by SRI, CAST, and their research and practice partners to improve content learning and higher order reasoning in biology and US history, with a particular focus on students with disabilities or other learning challenges. The project and evaluation were funded by an I3 development grant awarded in 2014. Enhanced Units leveraged content enhancement routines from the strategic instructional model developed by the University of Kansas. Routines included unit organizers, question exploration guides, cause-effect guides, and compare-contrast tables. These were selected and integrated with online technology into the Corgi tool, which allows students to collaboratively engage with the routines online. This is an example of one of the routines, the unit organizer. Research suggests that such organization of the content can help students engage in higher order reasoning, and routines such as this were adapted into an online collaborative tool that students could use on mobile or iPad devices. The key components of the project logic model are as follows. Inputs included the Enhanced Units curriculum and online Corgi tool, combined with professional development and ongoing coaching in order for teachers to receive sufficient support in implementing the program. The project developers expected that the curriculum combined with support would enable teacher implementation of Enhanced Units in their classrooms, followed by improved implementation and effectiveness. Teachers would improve implementation of the routines in their teaching, leading to improved student achievement on content assessment measures. Primary research questions for the evaluation study were as follows. Did students in grades 9 through 12 who attended high school Enhanced Units biology classes demonstrate higher order content knowledge in the biology unit test scores? Did 11th grade students who attended high school Enhanced Units US history classes demonstrate higher order content knowledge in the US history unit test scores? Did both groups of Enhanced Units students as a group demonstrate higher order content knowledge in their respective unit test scores? And secondary research questions for the evaluation were the same, but specific to students that received special education services. Finally, our team also examined several exploratory research questions, such as, is there a difference in impact on student achievement depending on teacher comfort with technology or specific content area? What is the level of treatment control contrast? And is there evidence that the program impacted mediators of student achievement? The RCT evaluation took place during spring of 2018 across 2 states and 5 high schools. There were 18 biology classes and 12 US history classes that were randomized, with 15 classes assigned to Enhanced Units and 15 classes assigned to the control condition of business as usual. Data collection included a baseline survey and student demographic information that was used to inform the randomization. During the study, daily implementation logs were collected from teachers, as well as end-of-unit teacher surveys and student assessments. At the end of the study, we conducted student surveys as well as teacher interviews. We estimated impacts of the program using a 3-level HLM analysis with content units nested within students nested within classes. We looked at biology and US history separately, then biology and history combined. In terms of effect sizes, adjusted based on covariates, we found no impact in biology, but a statistically significant effect in US history of moderate size. In addition, we found a marginally significant effect in the combined sample, where p is less than 0.1. Among the classes randomly assigned, none were lost to attrition during the study, as we obtained outcomes for 1 or more students present at baseline for each participating classroom. Student attrition for the history and biology combined samples was 3.8% overall and 2% differential attrition. Thus, there was low potential for bias in these impact estimates. In terms of moderator analyses, we found a positive differential impact of enhanced units on achievement depending on disability status. Impacts for each subgroup were 1.47 for students without disabilities and 9.5 for students with disabilities, with both of these reported in terms of the percent correct metric. This is especially relevant for the program developer since this was part of the evaluation's secondary research questions. We found no differential impact of enhanced units on achievement depending on teachers' reported comfort with technology. We also found that students on average experience greater impact of enhanced units in evolution than ecology. This result confirms within biology the developer's prediction of how enhanced units may work differentially based on content type. That was motivated by the finding of a positive impact in US history and no impact in biology. These results are considered exploratory. While we did find an impact, fidelity of implementation of the program was not met system-wide. This was across indicators such as teacher adherence, teacher quality of delivery, teacher perceived usefulness of tool strategies, student self-reported understanding, and student self-reported collaboration. None of these indicators met fidelity. However, treatment-controlled contrast was strong based on the use of the routines. There was no evidence of contamination based on the teacher's daily instructional logs, and in addition, teachers would not have had access to enhanced units materials in their control classes, nor would they have been able to access Corgi, the online collaborative tool. Finally, we saw no differences in impacts on mediators, either overall or within individual subjects. For example, looking at the first two mediators we examined, there was no difference in impact on these mediators from the program, with the first being explicit instruction and the second being reteach to a few students. As you can observe from the graph, there was no difference between or across contents in explicit instruction. And in the second example, there was very little difference in impact on this mediator. This raises questions about the logic model since none of the mediators were impacted, and yet we still saw an overall impact of the program. Therefore, we suggest additional exploration of mediators as an area of future research. More detailed information can be found in the full report available on Empirical's website. Empirical suggests the following areas for improvement. Based on the difference of impact within biology units, the program can provide additional support for less structured, less sequential content, as well as explore how the routines can be applied to more topics. In addition, the online technology tool can be improved as teachers reported some difficulties with students using the typing or using the routines in the online versus paper versions. For follow-on research, we suggest additional fleshing out of the logic model to better understand what mediates impact. We also suggest teasing out impact for students based on different types of learning disabilities. Finally, we suggest further investigation of the best ways for teachers to introduce SIM routines to their students in terms of both content as well as technology. If you have questions about this presentation or are interested in the report, please feel free to contact me at the email provided, or you may directly access the full Enhanced Units Report's website on the following URL. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks to the dog for contributing to this presentation as well.
Thanks, Hannah. So next up, Audra Wingard will be presenting on the CREATE Teacher Residency Program in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a quasi-experiment that was funded beginning in 2015 by an I3 development grant.
Great, thank you, Katie. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Audra, and I'm also with Empirical Education. Today, I'll be talking about our evaluation of a teacher residency program called CREATE. There are three of us here today from the research team at Empirical Education who worked on this project. I'll be presenting on the project, but like Hannah said, Jenna and Andrew are in the audience as well to answer any questions you may have for them. So CREATE is a 3-year teacher residency program for students in Georgia State University pursuing a degree to teach K through 8. Year 1 of the residency is the teacher student teaching year. Then years 2 and 3 are the first 2 years of the resident's career as full-time teachers. The mission of CREATE is to develop new teachers and critically conscious, compassionate, and skilled educators with the goal of retaining effective teachers in high-need schools and ultimately raising student achievement. So today I'll start by going through the logic model and then talk about the study design, our findings, challenges, and then finally what's next for the study. This is the logic model for CREATE under the I3 grant. It's important to know that the I3 was a development grant with the first cohort of residents in the study beginning in the 2015-2016 school year. So this logic model represents what the program looked like for cohorts 1 and 2 who were funded by I3. But because it was a development grant, the logic model has changed over time as the program has grown, developed, and changed. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail about each of the program components, but CREATE has 4 core components that are progressive core classroom roles, critical friends group, CBCT, multiple forms of mentoring, and the summer resident academy. And so the goal of those program components are to reach the following intermediate outcomes listed here, which we measure through annual quarterly surveys. In this presentation, we're going to focus specifically in on our analysis of CREATE's cognitively based compassion training and whether or not it achieves the intermediate outcome to grow and maintain executive function and flexible thinking in residents. We're choosing to discuss this particular outcome today because it's one of the measures that has had to adapt the most as the CREATE program has developed over time. And then finally, these are the long-term outcomes of CREATE. In order to assess the first long-term outcome, which is to increase teacher effectiveness, we collect the observation component of Georgia's statewide teacher evaluation system called TAP. To assess the next outcome, to decrease teacher attrition from high-need schools, we use our participant database, which houses all survey data and communications we have with the study participants, as well as teacher records from the Georgia Department of Education. We assess whether or not CREATE increases teacher satisfaction through our annual quarterly surveys. And we assess CREATE's impact on student achievement using Georgia's statewide student achievement test called Georgia Milestones. In sum, this study seeks to determine if CREATE has an impact on a set of flexible thinking skills in teachers that include mindfulness, resilience, self-compassion, and burnout, and if development of these self-regulatory behaviors are mediators for longer-term impacts on outcomes, including the retention of teachers in the profession, the quality of instruction they provide, and ultimately the achievement of their students. So next, I'll go into the design of the study. We use a quasi-experimental design with a matched comparison group. The treatment group consists of student teachers who join the CREATE program through the GSU Teacher Credential Program. The comparison group consists of student teachers who go through the GSU teaching program but who do not enroll in the CREATE program. We use the matched comparison group to infer how the CREATE participants would have performed had they not experienced the CREATE program. We add a new cohort of participants to the study each year and have currently just finished recruiting our 6th cohort. Next, I'll go into our findings and discuss some of the challenges we faced. So last year at SREE, we presented our findings regarding the impact of CREATE on these 5 measures related to flexible thinking skills. The analysis was done for cohorts 1 and 2 in their first 2 years of the residency. We had no statistically significant findings. However, we are currently in the process of analyzing measures for cohorts 1 and 2 in their 3rd year of the residency, as well as analyzing data on cohorts 3, 4, and 5 under seed funding. Because CREATE has developed significantly since these first 2 cohorts, we may find different results when we do this analysis. And also, when we found no statistically significant findings, we began to troubleshoot. First, we wondered, do impacts vary depending on individual attributes? We discussed that perhaps there are moderating factors that make CBCT more effective for some teachers and not for others. Next, we asked, are measures sensitive to the effects of the intervention? Since CREATE has developed their programming, we have adjusted our measures to reflect those changes. So to answer the first question, do impacts vary depending on individual attributes? We did find that there was a statistically significant positive impact of CREATE on teachers who reported higher levels of confidence in their general teaching skills on the measure of mindfulness, and teachers who reported higher levels of confidence in subject matter experienced a positive impact on mindfulness, stress management, and empathy related to teaching, and commitment to teaching. And then the next question we asked, sensitive to the effects of the intervention. To answer this question, we spent some more time trying to unpack the logic model to understand what mechanisms are at work in CREATE. We came to understand that mindfulness and resilience, which are the flexible thinking skills CREATE focuses on, in addition to self-compassion, are all mechanisms to reduce burnout, and reducing teacher burnout is the mechanism to reach CREATE's long-term outcomes. We were already measuring stress and resilience in our surveys through the 5-facet scale, stress management scale, and CD risk scale. However, we then modified our surveys to better encompass CREATE's whole model for impact by adding a scale to measure self-compassion and by adding the Maslach burnout scale. So now I'll go into our findings from the rest of the analysis, starting with our findings on teacher effectiveness as measured by Georgia's teacher evaluation scores. 2 dimensions measured in Georgia's teacher evaluations that we focused on are instructional strategies and positive learning environment. We saw very low variance in the post-test scores, which are represented here. Rater judgments as reflected on the measurement scale were not sensitive to small gradations on performance unless they were at the extreme. This was problematic for analysis because it indicated, even without an inferential test, that we will not observe an impact. So the findings here on TAP scores aren't necessarily bad news, they're just inconclusive. So next, we'll take a look at the impact of CREATE on student achievement scores. We did not find a statistically significant impact of CREATE on student achievement scores. However, it is important to note that we were left with a very small sample size for the analysis, and it's with that sample that no impact was observed on. The reason for the small sample size is due to a variety of things needing to be met in order for the teachers to even have student achievement scores in the Georgia Department of Education database. In order for the teachers to have the scores, they needed to be full-time teachers in math or ELA and teaching grades 3 through 8. Then in addition to those, people had to give us their consent to collect the scores. The fact that many of our teachers ended up in grades K through 2 or high school, or as teachers in non-tested subjects, or as part-time or assistant teachers were some of the biggest reasons for our small sample size. And then finally, we look at CREATE's impact on teacher retention. For teacher retention, we conducted a survival analysis. This graph shows survival estimates over time, which are the probabilities of being retained in teaching through 3 years of following the start of the residency for cohorts 1 and 2. We did not get statistically significant results for the entire sample, but when we limited the sample to Black educators, we found there was a positive and statistically significant impact on retention after 3 years for Black educators. So at the end of year 3, we found that there's a 91% probability that Black educators in the treatment group remain in teaching versus a 69% probability that Black educators in the control group remain in teaching. So finally, I'll discuss what's next for the study. The study is ongoing. And so first, we aim to increase our sample size by adding more cohorts of teachers. We plan to continue survey analysis for cohorts 3 through 5. We will investigate possible mediating mechanisms on teacher retention that we will capture through our annual surveys. And we would like to track teachers for additional years after they leave the CREATE program. And so that's all I have for us today, but there will be an upcoming report with more information on our final analyses. And yeah, that's all. Thanks. I'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Audra. Moving right along, for our last presentation, Tan Nguyen will be presenting on Empirical's RCT evaluation of Making Sense of Science, a professional learning model for science teachers developed by WestEd and funded by a I3 validation grant.
Thank you, Katie. Are you able to see my screen? Great. All right, so this presentation is about uncovering the black box, specifically by looking at impacts on mediators for Making Sense of Science, which is a science teacher professional learning model. And I also want to acknowledge Jenna and Andrew, who are in the audience, who are also on the Create and Enhance Unit team. They were also part of the Making Science evaluation team. So I will first briefly describe the landscape for science instruction as the study was being conducted. I'll provide an overview of MSS and the study, our methods and findings, and I'll end with some reflections to make sense of the findings. So at the beginning of the decade, there was a host of evidence showing that science education was not where we wanted to be or needed to be as a nation, which prompted the release of the Next Generation Science Standards in 2013. And one fundamental change emphasized in NGSS was the shift from focus on content knowledge to three-dimensional learning that included content, cross-cutting concepts, and science and engineering practices. The adoption of these standards set off a chain of reaction of standard adoption and steps toward implementing the standards. And it was in this context that we conducted the study of Making Sense of Science. So Making Sense of Science is a model for science teacher professional learning that was developed by WestEd. The model focuses on critical connections between science understanding, classroom practices, and literacy support in ways that support the implementation of NGSS and the Common Core state standards. The model consists of capacity building for school administrators and a leadership cadre, and professional learning for teachers, including 30 hours of summer courses and 12 hours of professional learning communities, or PLCs, for each of the 2 years. In the interest of time, I'll go through the MSS logic model at a very high level. So MSS hypothesizes that the provision of capacity building for leaders and teachers will have a cascade of effects on teacher content knowledge, teacher pedagogical content knowledge, and teacher attitudes and beliefs. The combination of shifts in teacher and leader outcomes would lead to changes in school climate, such as greater district support, greater administrator support, culture of collaboration, and greater trust among teachers and administrators, as well as changes in students' opportunity to learn in regard to time spent on science instruction, instructional practices, content, and classroom climate. And all this, in turn, would impact student science achievement and non-academic outcomes, such as enjoyment of science and aspirations for science careers. Of course, these relationships are complex and not necessarily one-directional, as I've described them here. So this study is part of an I3 validation grant to WestEd. The impact study was a 2-year cluster or school-level randomized controlled trial conducted in 2 states, California and Wisconsin, across 7 districts and 60 randomized units, or 66 elementary schools, consisting of 329 teachers of approximately 8,000 students. The study addressed 3 confirmatory research questions, mainly after 2 years of MSS implementation. What was the impact of MSS on 1, teacher content knowledge, 2, impact of student science achievement in 4th and 5th grade, and 3, impact on student science achievement among students in the lowest third of incoming achievement. The study also assessed a number of exploratory research questions, but the ones we focus on today are those related to impacts on the potential mediators. And we also touch on fidelity of implementation to round out the picture. So the study collected a rich set of data listed above for teachers, students, and administrators. For this analysis, since we're specifically interested in intermediate outcomes, we employed primarily the teacher survey from the winter and spring of the 2nd year of the study. This particular analysis was based on a sample of 147 teachers and employs a 3-level hierarchical linear model, teachers, schools, and matched pairs, that regresses each of the 30 intermediate outcomes on an indicator of assignment status and a series of teacher and school level covariates. So now we unpack the logic model. I'll start sharing findings for our confirmatory research questions. We found that there was a positive impact on teacher content knowledge and on teacher pedagogical content knowledge on the holistic scale. We did not find a positive impact on student science achievement, and also no impact on students who are in the lowest third in incoming ELA achievement. We did, however, find a marginally significant impact on those in the lowest third incoming math achievement. So our question was, well, what happened between the significant and positive findings for teacher content knowledge and teacher pedagogical content knowledge and the null impact findings for student achievement? We look first at impact on MSS on teacher attitudes and beliefs. So for each outcome, we assessed impact on the full group of teachers represented by the first bar for each outcome. We also assessed differential impacts for teacher leaders and non-teacher leaders, which are reported in the 2nd and 3rd bar for each outcome. But in the interest of time, I'll only focus on the result for the full group, so just the top bar, though I believe the slides will be available online if you want to take a closer look at the differential impacts. So for teacher attitudes and beliefs, we found a positive impact on teachers' sense of agency in the classroom and a marginally significant impact on confidence in science instructional practices. We found a positive impact on time spent on science, with MSS teachers spending about 2 hours more than control teachers over the course of 4 weeks. We also found either significant or marginally significant effects on all 4 opportunity to learn instructional practice outcomes. So MSS teachers report placing greater emphasis on instructional practices such as sense-making of hands-on investigations, participating in collaborative discourse, and integration of science literacy. In contrast, unfortunately, we found no positive impact on opportunity to learn derived through NGSS content or disciplinary core ideas. The same was true for science engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts, though with the exception of a few, all of the effect sizes are positive. We found a positive impact on administrators supporting teacher collaboration, and a marginally significant impact on administrators involving teachers in science leadership. Finally, we saw that MSS teachers report spending more time on informal peer collaboration, that is collaboration beyond MSS directed, collaboration beyond MSS directed professional learning. So we take a pause here to acknowledge that we looked at 30 outcomes. So it's possible that some of these findings are significant based on chance alone, but the fact that all 4 OTL instructional practices outcomes were positive and significant, and all 10 OTL content outcomes were not significant, does give us greater confidence in the reliability of the results of these 2 specific domains. So in summary, we noticed impacts on proximal outcomes, such as teacher content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and opportunity to learn instructional and practices, and a few positive impacts on school climate directly related to the PLCs. We did not see impacts on outcomes that are distal, either because they are long-standing, deeply ingrained attitudes and beliefs, or they may be impacts that take longer time to observe, or they're harder to move the needle on because they are impacted by so many other factors beyond professional learning. So what happens between the positive proximal findings to the null distal findings? Our first hypothesis takes us back to the beginning of the presentation when I mentioned that the study was conducted soon after NGSS was released. No NGSS aligned assessment was available at the time, and we had to make the very difficult decision of developing an assessment for the study. The test ended up being difficult. There was low test information, so low score reliability for students with low incoming achievement. So we have to interpret the findings using this assessment with some caution. Our second hypothesis is again related to the timing of the study. Coherent curriculum and corresponding curriculum resources were not yet available in participating states and districts at the time. Here are the resources used in California, and there's anecdotal data that we have to confirm that participating districts were using textbooks that were as old as 10 years old, which are even before the time that NGSS was released. And in Wisconsin, while some NGSS aligned resources were available, a coherent curriculum was not yet made available to participating districts. So our third and final hypothesis is that the instability of the sample over the 2 years compromised fidelity of implementation. Looking at fidelity in each of the 2 years separately, we see very high percentages of teachers attending summer courses and PLCs for each of the 2 years. There was very strong uptake of the professional learning. However, when we look at fidelity across the 2 years, meaning that teachers have to be in the study for both years in order to meet fidelity, attendance rates dropped significantly to just a little bit more than a half of the teachers. So this resulted from the high mobility of teachers leaving participating schools or study eligible grades or subjects. So in unpacking the black box, we hope that we've highlighted areas that would benefit from deep reflection by program developers and evaluators, as well as bringing to surface some tensions that exist in conducting an evaluation for programs in the midst of significant change. Thank you. And our full report will be made available later this fall.
Great, thanks, Tan. Okay, we are almost done. We're going to pass this on to Ann Wolf at APT for some reflections on these 4 different studies that were just presented. And then if anyone has any questions for any of the presenters, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. We hopefully will have a couple minutes at the end for Q&A.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope you guys can see my screen. I'm going to look for somebody to nod. Okay, super. Great. I'm Ann Wolf from Apt Associates, and I just want to start by thanking all of the panelists for their thoughtful presentations. I'm going to try to move as rapidly as I can through so that we have some time for questions. Let's see. So as part of the I3 grant program, the evaluators all collaborated with program developers to articulate the logic model for the intervention, which served as a tool to guide their evaluation designs. And okay, so a logic model must begin with defining the key intervention components. These are the inputs that are hypothesized to be necessary for the intervention to have the intended impacts on students. And then also the mediators in the logic model are the intermediate or proximal outcomes that the intervention components are expected to affect directly. The mediators are the mechanisms of change. It's by producing the changes in the intermediate outcomes that the intervention's key components are expected to improve student outcomes. In addition, moderators can reflect the context of the intervention implementation. Moderator is a variable that affects the size of the intervention's effect on outcomes. Moderators can specify when a relationship will hold and for whom. A moderator can be an antecedent to the intervention, such as pre-existing characteristics of teachers or students, like demographics, prior experience, or skills. It can also be the conditions of implementation or differences in a feature of the intervention, such as mode or intensity of delivery. Today's presentations each examined interventions effects on mediators, differences in intervention effects based on moderators or both. The evaluations of enhanced units presented by Hannah, Create presented by Audra, and Making Sense of Science presented by Tan all conducted analyses to explore how the intervention works, to understand the extent to which key intervention components have immediate effects on school climate, teachers' knowledge, mindset, or retention, the classroom learning environment, as well as intermediate student outcomes. In theory, the intervention would not be expected to improve longer-term student outcomes like achievement, credit accumulation, graduation, or college access without changing intermediate outcomes, such as teachers or instructional practice. By examining effects on mediators, the presenters were able to explore whether there's support for the proposed theory of change for the intervention that they were evaluating. They each looked within the logic model to examine the pathways that are hypothesized to achieve the targeted student outcomes. There are several challenges to measuring effects on mediators that prevent many impact evaluations from exploring these intermediate impacts. First, cost can be an obstacle. Intermediate outcomes are typically measured using surveys and observations, and as a result, they're generally more expensive to measure than student achievement outcomes, which can often be measured using less expensive extant data. Second, although there are clear benefits to the field for building theories about how interventions can impact student outcomes, many intermediate outcomes like teacher knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs are not reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse. This fact, combined with the added cost of collecting these data, can work together to prevent studies from exploring effects on intermediate outcomes. Third, examining impacts on mediators is only part of the hypothesized pathway from which the intervention, to improved student outcomes. These analyses demonstrate the effects of the intervention on intermediate outcomes, but do not also provide evidence that changes in mediators produce changes in student outcomes. Evaluations that find positive impacts on mediators and student outcomes can conduct further analyses like path analysis to estimate indirect effects of the intervention on student outcomes through the mediators. Fourth, when the evaluation does find no impacts on mediators, the lack of findings can be difficult to interpret. It could be that the theory of change is not supported and needs to be reconceptualized. However, it could be that the intervention was not implemented with fidelity, or that participants did not receive a sufficient amount of exposure. Or the issue could be a measurement problem. For example, the evaluations of enhanced units and CREATE didn't find impacts on mediators, and both suggested that measures which showed little variation may not have been sufficiently sensitive to changes in teacher instruction that were produced by the intervention. In addition to examining impacts on mediators, today's presentations also examine differences in impacts on students. The evaluations of peer group connections, enhanced units, and CREATE examined antecedents to understand for whom the interventions worked. They examined effects on students based on pre-existing differences between students and differences between teachers. And they also examined other moderators, differences in intervention features to understand under what conditions the intervention works. Through these analyses, the evaluations explored the conditions that support effectiveness. In particular, they examined the intervention conditions associated with impacts, such as intensity, duration, content, and subject area. And in addition, guided by hypotheses about why impacts might differ for different groups of students or teachers, they explored for whom the intervention worked. In particular, they examined differences based on student characteristics before the intervention, such as demographics, English learner status, special education status, level of engagement in school, social emotional skills, as well as teacher characteristics before the intervention, content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, confidence in teaching, and the like. There are challenges to measuring moderators as well. First, estimating impacts for different groups often means that the evaluation will conduct many statistical tests. And with more statistical tests, type 1 error increases. This refers to a false positive or finding a statistically significant impact when there is no effect. So more tests conducted, the more tests we can expect to be statistically significant, even when there is no effect. To minimize the issue of increased type 1 error, the moderators that are examined should be guided by hypotheses about why impacts might differ by those characteristics or conditions. Another challenge is limited statistical power for detecting impacts on subgroups or detecting differences between subgroups. Minimum detectable effect sizes for subgroups are lower than for the full sample because sample sizes are smaller. And in addition, the power for detecting differences in effect sizes for different subgroups is even lower than for detecting impacts for a given subgroup. And I'm not going to go into this example showing on the screen other than to say that the MDE for detecting differences is more than twice and nearly 3 times the MDE for detecting a main effect. So when you're planning to investigate subgroup differences and impacts, it's important to have that in mind when you're designing the evaluation to be sure that you'll have the needed statistical power to test those differences. So to wrap up, the field can certainly benefit from more studies like today's presentations that shed light on our understanding of the pathways through which interventions affect student outcomes, for whom interventions are most effective, as well as conditions that support effectiveness. This information can help program developers refine their logic models and make modifications to the intervention to maximize their effectiveness. And now I will turn things back to Katie, and we'll have a little time for questions as soon as I figure out how to stop sharing.
Thanks, Anne. So we have not received any questions in the chat box yet, but thank you, Ellen, for posting a link to the location where the slides from today and the recording will be available on SREE's website. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat box. Otherwise, I think Anne had maybe a couple follow-up questions, if no one else has any.
Okay. I guess I will go ahead. Let's see. So I guess I will. Oh, Okay. I will start with a question for you, Katie, about the case analysis and propensity score weighting approaches that you use to examine impacts of full participation on students. And I think I'm wondering if you explored different levels of participation and their effects. And I'm also interested to know about how consistent the results were from those two different approaches.
Yeah, I will do that briefly because we did get a question from Julie. So we did look at different levels of dosage in our case analyses, and we also conferred with CSS, our partners, about what they thought from their perspective what a full dose of the program would be. So they recommend to schools that they offer a minimum of 18 outreach sessions during the school year. And so we acknowledge that sometimes students are just absent from school, and so we set the bar fairly high at 16 for our full dosage definition. But we did look at lower thresholds of around 14 or 10 or so, and of course the results were not quite as robust as they were when you look at a much higher dosage. In terms of the comparison between the instrumental variable and propensity score approaches, they were fairly consistent. Of course, like the point estimates were different, but in terms of the pattern that we were seeing, they were fairly consistent across a number of the outcomes, including suspensions and the social and emotional skills. But there were one or two differences on one or two non-cognitive scales. But what we really focused on, or what we intend to focus on for our paper that we're putting together, are where there is consistency between the two approaches, because they have their own untestable assumptions that sort of balance each other out. So you can feel more confident where there's consistency between the two. And then we've got only about a minute left, but Julie wants to know if anyone can comment on the value of exploring mediators in the absence of overall positive impacts. If anyone from the empirical team wants to take a stab at that one.
This is Andrew. I could just jump in here quickly and say, I think there's value. I think like in the old Barr and Kenny approach, the first rounds kind of said, if there's no impact on the final outcome, don't explore impacts on mediators. But there could be different pathways that cancel each other out that lead to sort of no distal effect. But you might still see impacts through different mechanisms. So like I might run and, well, I'm not going to get into that example, but I have a good example.
Yeah, and I was going to add that it was a really valuable process for us. We learned, there were many lessons learned during that process, but I think two good examples are, one is that we saw that there was significant and positive impact on all of the OTL instruction intermediate outcomes. And then another sort of glaring finding that we could not ignore was the fact that we didn't see any significant or positive findings for OTL that's derived through content, which made us really question the relevance of curriculum and curriculum resources, and really compelled us to dig into the literature on the relevance of curriculum resources in combination with teacher professional learning to produce student achievement.
Great. Well, I think that is our time for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to all the presenters and for Anne for your reflections. And of course, slides and the recording will be posted on SREE's website. And yeah, I think there's contact information that will be in the slides. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to any member of today's research team.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.